Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this Career by Design webinar, Disabilities at Work, Positive Disclosures with Marci Shaffer. My name is Michelle Rapp. I'm the Associate Director of Alumni Career Strategy in the Office of Alumni Relations, and we develop different types of career programs and resources for alumni and are always interested in your ideas about what would be helpful. So I'd like to start by introducing Marci. And also letting you know that to participate in the webinar, there is a menu on the bottom right corner of the page. And if you click on the purple arrows, you'll be able to access the chat menu, which is the little bubble menu. And so you're welcome to post questions as we go throughout the webinar, and Marci will be addressing the questions throughout. So to tell you a little bit more about Marci, as a natural champion, coach, leader, and employment professional, Marci Shaffer is passionate about helping people find their best path. She's been a career coach for over 18 years, including managing a private career and college coaching practice since 2007. Her private practice places emphasis on helping college graduates with hidden disabilities to launch into employment. Specialties include Asperger's syndrome, anxiety and depression disorders, and ADHD. Marci had the pleasure of working in the Disability Services Office at Northeastern and co-created the first of its kind strategic partnership between the Disability Resource Center, the co-op program, and career development, with the goal of improving employment outcomes for students with disabilities. This signature partnership program continues to grow and expand. Marci also has a Master of Science in Human Resource Management from Northeastern. Currently, Marci is a co-chair of the Careers Special Interest Group for the Association of Higher Education and Disabilities. We're delighted to have her here as our webinar guest speaker today. Thank you, Marci.
Thank you. Is that my cue?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. Hello. Thank you, Michelle, and welcome, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here. So let's actually get going. Let's see what we've got to talk about, what our agenda is. We will be talking, obviously about disclosure of a disability, but it will be in the context of thinking about disclosure as part of your career success. Okay, so I want to talk about this in a very holistic way. So we'll be talking about that. In addition to putting the conversation into context, is discussing very briefly about the American with Disabilities Act and the American with Disabilities Act as amended. I have a slide and some links to further information for you. We'll discuss that, and then we'll talk about your right fit disclosure strategy. If you do decide to disclose at any point, you really need to have a strategy. And discussing accommodations in terms of what's a reasonable accommodation and what's your right fit accommodation. And we'll discuss a little bit about if you are a person with a disability or you work with people who are, or somehow you coach others who have disabilities, thinking about seeking out diversity-minded employers. So on that note, let's move forward. So we do have a poll here. I'm just trying to get a little bit of an idea of who is, who's in our audience. If you could take a look at this poll and respond, that would be helpful. Okay. Okay, excellent. Great. Now, I'm going to ask you, Michelle, do people have access to the poll results, or is that only something I can see?
People should be able to see the responses.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks. Okay, and everyone on the line, thank you for being patient with me. This is the first time I've used this this type of webinar platform. Okay, actually, somebody's making a really good point. Can we take the poll down? Should I just, there we go. Okay, excellent. Thanks for letting us know, Anne, and now everyone should have access to the captioning if you, in fact, selected that. Okay, great. Okay, so it looks like we had sort of a mixed group. Some people are in job search, some people are employed, and some people on the line are either in job search, employed, and you are a person with a disability. So that's great. Okay, let's move forward. Okay, so remember, we're here to talk about disclosure, positive disclosures in the context of your career. And I really want you to be thinking about this in terms of, again, more broadly and holistically in terms of your career, and that you are your own brand. And you probably, if any of you have worked with the career services at Northeastern University, or you've done any kind of work with a career coach or read articles, you know that you really, this is sort of common for people to consider in terms of having you think about yourself as your own brand. And we'll talk about what that means as it relates to, as it relates to being a person with a disability. So your years of working experience, if you can, there should be a poll that pops up for that. That will be helpful to get just a little sense of where people are in terms of their working life. Okay. So it looks like we've got a combination of some people who've got like 0 to 4 years of experience, and then some people have more than 8 years of experience. That's great. That's just really helpful for me to know. Great. Okay, excellent. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about your career and you as a brand. So, one of the things that I want to say is that I do a lot of work and a lot of coaching with people who have disabilities and people who don't. And I really work with each client in terms of, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little distracted by the pop-up, so forgive me. Maybe if I can close that window so I don't see them. So I work with everybody in the same way. And so whether you are a person with a disability or not, you really need to understand who you are and what your brand is. And so elements of your brand are really knowing what your skills are. What are your personal skills? What are your functional skills and your technical skills, right? And these would be things like, are you somebody who demonstrates tenacity? Are you somebody who works well with spreadsheets? Are you somebody who does coding? We want all of it. We want to know who you are as it relates to your personal function and functional and technical skills. And what are your interests? Your personal interests and your work-related interests, right? What makes you you? Your experience. You need to really know what your successes are and be able to communicate your successes and your achievements, right? So very frequently I will talk with folks and they're not able to really communicate that really clearly, well, or broadly. And this is really critical for all of us, is you really need to be able to tell your story and your experience. And then your strengths, where do you shine, right? So you really need to know that and be able to communicate that. Now, your elements of a brand as it relates to you as a person with a disability is that you really need to know and understand your specific disability, right? And so this is where the branding comes in, is know your own brand. So when you are a person who might have a medical condition or even a non-apparent disability, no two disabilities are alike. So you can be a person, for example, you can be a person who has, a diagnosis of ADHD, or a person who has a diagnosis of Asperger's or autism spectrum disorder. And no two people will be alike in terms of how that difference impacts their ability to learn or in terms of what how people learn and who they are. So you need to really get clear on what is your brand of disability. So how does it, if at all, impact you at work, right? And then what are the challenges that the disability, how does that impact you at work? Be really clear about that. And so what you want to do is have this, you want to think about this, right? And you want to self-reflect and be self-aware, but you want to get it onto paper, right? So you want to really get it onto paper. Don't just hold this stuff into your head. You want to know what your best fit strategies are. So as I'm working with people and we're saying, okay, great, what's your brand, right? What's your disability, or what are the pieces of your disability that impact you at work, right? And then what are some of those challenges? What do those look like? How would I know that you are having some of these challenges or experiencing these challenges in a working environment? And then you can't stop there. What you have to then do is figure out, okay, great, what are my strategies to overcome these specific challenges, right? So how can these help you succeed at work? And so that's why, again, I'm really encouraging you all to kind of consider disability in a holistic way as it relates to you as being a person who works, right? And a person who wants to grow their career. And then the third point I want to make on this slide is, know your disclosure strategy. So do you even need to request accommodation, and knowing the timing of that, how to disclose, when to disclose, to whom do you disclose. So this is really, this is a strategy that requires you to reflect, to assess, to know what you need, and to really kind of practice what you'll say. You need to know what you'll be requesting. And by the way, not everything is an accommodation. And so, what I mean by that is, let's just say you are somebody who gets easily distracted by noise or sound, or you have a sensitivity to sound. And what helps you to work better is having headphones, right? You might have like noise canceling headphones. Well, if you work in an office space, it's really kind of the culture is it's probably like a younger culture, it's a newer culture, maybe it's an open office concept. They have ping pong tables on one end, very open, and pool on the other end, and then everybody's offices are in the middle. And it's common for people to wear headphones at work. You probably don't need to request an accommodation to wear headphones, because it's already being done by everybody else. So you kind of have to keep that into mind as well in terms of your own situation and the culture of your employer. Right? So one of the other things that I know that we wanted to encourage you to do is, if you have any questions or you have any insight or comments, please do feel free to use the chat feature, and Michelle will help us with that when you make any comments or insights or have any questions that are specific to what we're discussing. And if you have some questions that I know we're going to be discussing further into the slides, I'll let you know. So just wanted to encourage everybody to actively participate. Okay. So here we go. So let's put the conversation into context, right? Because we are talking about disclosure of a disability. And so, I'm, as Michelle said in the introduction, my wheelhouse is career development. It's career coaching. It's career development, career coaching with people of a diverse range of abilities, those who are typical and those who are sort of neurotypical, right? But why we're even having this discussion is because people with disabilities are covered by, there's laws that protect people with disabilities from being discriminated against. And, while I'm not a lawyer, right, I'm more of a career strategist in career management development, you should really know what these laws are. And so I'm just going to cover really briefly, very high level, what these laws are, but just to say that, the Americans with Disabilities Act was really the first comprehensive civil rights law that really, it was designed to protect individuals with disabilities from discrimination. And what came prior to that, which I don't have on the slide, is in 19, you know what, forgive me, I'm not sure I'm going to have the date right. I think it was either 74 or 78, forgive me, was the passage of the Rehabilitation Act. And that was to cover people, that was to prohibit discrimination against people with disabilities who worked for the federal government. So they had these rights far longer than we in the public sector and non-government sector have had, access to. But so then that led to the 1990 passage of the American with Disabilities Act. And then in 2008, the American with Disabilities Act was actually amended. And what that really did was it just broadened the scope of who is considered to be a person with a disability, okay? And, one of the things I have an asterisk on here is that it also impacted this newer definition and broadening scope of who is a person with a disability. It actually impacted Section 503 of the Rehab Act, and that's the Rehab Act that I actually just mentioned that was originally passed in either 74 or 78. And this was really a game changer, this 2008 and this broadening of the scope. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So let's see. So actually, there's a question. I guess, Michelle, I'll go ahead and just address this one question. You asked a question about when companies hire and fire, how can you ensure that you are protected when disclosing a disability? And so first of all, let me just thank you very much for that question. It's a very important question. And of course, the ADA is designed to prohibit discrimination in all phases of the process. It's the interviewing process, the hiring process, the being promoted process, right? Being considered for promotions and career growth and things like that. And so there are these laws, of course, but, is there latent bias? Do companies do this and discriminate unintentionally and unknowingly? I would say it probably does happen. But I guess what I want to share with you is that my take on this is I share with you that these laws and that we are protected by laws. But I ask you to kind of look at this as sort of a conversation, as not in a legal way in terms of us versus them, but in a win-win way. And, you're never going to know if it's very subtle, if a disclosure of a disability has somehow, affected your candidacy. If an employer is doing it unintentionally or unknowingly, sometimes you won't know that. Just like you don't know when you are applying for a position and you're covered by laws that prohibit people like me, I'm over 40. So there are laws that protect me from being discriminated against by employers on the basis of age alone, right? So sometimes you hear about people who are concerned about discrimination against age discrimination. So you know what, it does happen, but what I want you to think about is if you do this in a way where you're thinking about disclosure, you're thinking about disability in terms of your entire career success, think about it holistically. I think that that's sort of the way to go and to think about this. And I can say more about that if you need me to. So let's just talk a little bit about the definition of disability. And again, this is sort of the legal definition. And one of the things that I want you to think about here to walk away with this, the takeaway from this slide really is it's a physical or mental impairment, and it substantially limits one or more major life activities. So what we kind of think about is sort of functional limitations when we're thinking about disability. But this is the legal sort of definition. But remember that I said that in 2008, where they had the American with Disabilities Act as amended, and they broadened the scope of who is considered to be a person with a disability, is that you will find, I have found, I've been doing this work with, as it relates to disability and inclusion, and working with employers on, initiatives and what they're doing to be more inclusive, running programs to recruit top talent who are college students with disabilities and alum with disabilities. Companies are really looking for really smart people that they can add to their talent pool who also happen to be a person with a disability. And so they're not concerned with these definitions. What they are concerned with is if you come forward and you share that you have kind of physical or mental impairment, they're going to help you out with that. They're not going to look at this definition. They're going to help you out. They're going to want to have kind of a, companies follow an interactive process and help you succeed. Okay. So when we're talking about, medical conditions or, sort of mental or physical or not, is that, a lot of times people don't know that they are a person that could be covered by, these laws or these initiatives or these kinds of programs at work. So not every disability is visible or apparent. And this is just a listing of what some of those might be. Some of you have diabetes, type 2, maybe insulin dependent or not, you're covered, So this is just a list that to think more broadly about, that if you are a person with any of these disabilities, that you could be considered covered and should think about, what this means is okay, really all this means is, okay, you could be considered a person with a disability if you have these sort of diagnoses, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you actually even need to disclose, because you may not need workplace accommodation. So it's kind of tricky and complex at times. So again, if you do have any kind of comments or insights that you want to share about your own experience or anything, if I'm saying anything that contradicts what you know to be true, please let me know, so that we can talk that through and mention that. So disclosure 360, we kind of look at this, right, as sort of in these quadrants. And this is really why, earlier on when I talked about your brand and really self-reflecting and self-evaluating and assessing, knowing what your strengths are, knowing what your challenges are, knowing what your challenges are as it relates to your disability, okay, and then coming up with strategies to overcome that. One of the things that I want to say is that if you are a person with a disability and you choose to disclose, it's not your employer's responsibility to come up with helpful accommodations. That's your responsibility, because they don't know you as well, right? They don't know your skills. They haven't done that broad assessment of who you are and what your brand of disability is. So this is your responsibility, right? So let's talk a little bit more about this. So disclosure, why might you disclose? So you might disclose because, some of the obvious reasons is you need to request a workplace accommodation, right? And in order to get a workplace accommodation that is disability related, you do need to disclose, okay? And let me just see this for one moment. I'm sorry, I'm a little new to this program here. Okay, so Michelle, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to rely on you if we get any questions. If you could let me know what we should do, because I'm getting a little distracted,
Yes.
so I sort of, yeah.
Yeah, let me ask one question that's here about when filling out an application, many companies request gender, veteran status, and then ask if you have a disability. Usually the choice is yes, no, or choose not to answer. I always select that I choose not to answer. Can this impact my application? I'm not sure who actually sees this.
Right, that's a really great question. And so, and I think that's a timely question too. So, you know, in my perspective, so first of all, let's talk about who sees it. So that goes sort of, it's redirected to, it doesn't go to the hiring manager. It does stay within the human resources sort of applicant tracking system, but it doesn't stay with your application. So the reason why companies ask that, these are sort of questions that are encouraging candidates or applicants to self-identify, is because companies, so, you know, I had commented on the game changer, the 503, when they broadened the scope of who's a person with a disability, and the 503 is really, of the Rehab Act, that's really, I'm sorry? Oh, that really applies to, it applies to companies that are federal contractors, and they have some very aggressive, we call them aspirations, right? So if you are a federal contractor, the federal government has said that they want your workforce to be composed and comprised of, within each job function, be comprised of 7% of employees who are people with disabilities. Okay, so, and I think it's even for some employers, I think the federal government, it's raised to 9%. So that was a real big game changer in terms of that law. And so companies are asking these questions, like this person just asked about, you get this form that asks you to self-disclose, is because companies have to report that, are they actually even interviewing and getting candidates that are people with disabilities? So in a way, that does not impact, nobody knows that you've filled that out. And I know it feels vulnerable and kind of scary to fill that out, because you might think that it would be viewed by somebody who's part of the application process, but it is not. And the other thing, what I want to say about that is that, you know, my coaching practice is comprised, about, you know, 80% of the people that I work with are people with disabilities, and this question comes up, and they think that because they've checked the box that says yes on the person with a disability, well, they've disclosed, so that when they get in for the interview, or when they get on board, let's just say they're hired, well, they think, well, I've already disclosed, and no, that's not disclosure. And for the very reason that that form goes somewhere else, that it's really just a reporting metric. Okay, so I hope I've answered that question for you, and that concern, which is a very valid concern. So another one of the reasons why you would disclose would be really just to seek better understanding. You know, sometimes people with disabilities, they don't necessarily need a technical, sort of like a technical accommodation. So like, you know, accommodations like dragon speech for somebody who might have mobility issues, maybe with their hands, and they don't use the keyboard to type, rather they use speech to text. And dragon speech, or there's so many other kind of products on the market. But these are products that are sort of technical assistance, technical accommodations that can help you do your job, right? So there's that, or say you're a wheelchair user, and maybe your accommodation is just to have a desk that is at a higher level to just accommodate the height of your wheelchair. Okay, so, you know, we think about those. But sometimes you don't actually require any of those technical kinds of accommodations, but rather it could be for somebody who might have some social communication issues, somebody who has Asperger's, who might disclose and say, what might be really helpful for me is when I first start, whenever I first start with a new employer, it's really hard for me to figure out how to best fit in, or sometimes it can just be, it's really difficult for me to, maybe know how to fit in. So if somebody could be a mentor or a buddy, or if you could help guide me to help me to just fit in better with the team, I would really appreciate that. So that could be an accommodation, that could be a request, right? And then sometimes, the reason why you might disclose is just to reduce stress, because sometimes when you're keeping a secret of this this non-apparent disability, it can be really exhausting and stressful, and that can impact your work. So sometimes just sharing it to say, I want you to know this about me. You don't necessarily have to do anything, but I want you to have this information, just to open the lines of communication. And so when do you disclose? And this kind of gets a little bit to, what the earlier question we had is that in terms of when you get those forms are not disclosing, right? So we already kind of checked that box. We know that that's not disclosing. But disclose on your application or directly on your resume, which is very unusual, I have to say. The only time you would is if you were applying for a program or an employer that is specifically looking for people with your skills, your experience, your level of education, and who also happen to have a disability. Okay, so that makes you really uniquely qualified for that role. And so that would be the only time that you do that on your application or resume. Another time when you would request or when you might disclose is at the interviewing process. So, for example, if you go into your interview and you're a wheelchair user, you might say something like, just want to be prepared for my interview next week, and just ensure that your building or your office that we'll be meeting at is accessible. I'm a wheelchair user. And then you put a period at the end of the sentence, and you don't need to say anything else. You don't need to make any excuses. You just say it as if it's that's all you're asking for. And you're just, again, you're seeking that understanding. You don't want to surprise them, so that they can know to expect you to come in with using a wheelchair, and that they have everything available for you and they're ready for you. And then also, you don't be surprised to get there and find out, oh, this place isn't, wheelchair accessible. So you could also disclose after the job offer or any time during your employment, because, sometimes people become diagnosed with a disability across their lifetime. So when they started, they didn't have a disability, but perhaps at some point during their employment, they became a person with a disability. And so the timing is really important, because you don't want to wait until it's too late. You don't want to wait until you're having performance issues.
Marci,
Yep.
Marci, we have a question. We have two questions. One is someone who has rheumatoid arthritis, and although I have it under control now, I'm afraid in the future I will not. When would I want to disclose this to my company? I work for a large company and I've already been there 20 years.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much for sharing that question and for asking it, so that we can all benefit from that. So again, I do want to say I'm not giving you legal advice. This we know by now that I'm not a lawyer. But I would say that, if you anticipate it impacting your performance, then you would disclose that. But what you're saying is that you have it under control, so you don't have any reason to believe that you would be needing to, take time off or maybe ask for an accommodation or a workplace accommodation due to that. Now, I do want to say, so I don't know where you work. You said you've been there for 20 years. Now, many of these companies who are considered federal contractors, who have this aspiration, the 7% aspiration that I spoke about earlier, of really trying to track and get metrics on the fact that they need to be showing good faith effort and be diligent in recruiting, hiring, promoting people with disabilities. And another part of that Section 503 that sort of the I don't know what I want to say is that law is that employers are actually required on a yearly basis to send out self-identification sort of questionnaires to all of their current employees to see if they actually already are employing people who have disabilities. And so that's another piece of it. So I don't know if maybe you've gotten that and you've identified through that. But again, as I've said, that's actually not disclosing, right? That's just giving information that helps them kind of stay in line and track their workforce. How many people do they actually have that are people who consider themselves to be people with a disability? So that question about your rheumatoid arthritis and that it's in check, I guess that's a hard one. That's a hard one to say, is that you have to decide if it could be that you're disclosing because you want just better understanding, or maybe it reduces some kind of stress for you because you're kind of feeling like you don't know when you might be impacted by some of the some of the symptoms of the rheumatoid arthritis. And so maybe just to reduce your own stress, you could share that. So that's a tough one. So by no means is that something that I can really just respond to. That you kind of have to tease that apart and then decide for yourself what's the best for you. And then, yeah. Do we have any more questions,
Yes.
Michelle? Or
Marci, what if none of your suggestions for helpful accommodations are considered reasonable by your employer?
Okay. Well, again, I don't know what I don't know. Well, first of all, again, answering this question without a lot of information is that most employers, if not all, have a process called the interactive process. So if you disclose to HR, essentially what happens is you start entering a conversation. It's called the interactive process, where you ask for the reasonable accommodations that relate directly to your disability, and then how that accommodation can help you, actually continue to work, right, and do your work and be productive. So I don't know, again, I don't know what you'd be requesting that they would find not reasonable. But there are going to be some things an employer has the right and would find a not a reasonable accommodation. But that's why there's the iterative process. So what that means is that, your employer would come back and say, okay, well, you've asked for this accommodation. We can't do that, or we'd like to propose, this accommodation for you. Would you be willing to work with that? So it becomes almost like a negotiation. Okay. So I hope that answers a little bit of that. These are kind of hard questions to answer without a lot of information. And again, I'm not giving you any legal advice, but rather I'm really trying to help us all have this conversation, and maybe even some of the links on the resource pages that I'll be providing in the PowerPoint. Maybe some of those might be helpful resources for you to look into to help you better answer your question. And so the final quadrant here is to whom do we disclose? And that's typically, you could disclose to your boss or human resources rather. If you do work for a large employer, many large employers actually have they have people who are identified that you would specifically go to disclose a disability and start that interactive process for accommodation. Okay, so I want to get moving here because I want to make sure that I get through all these slides. So we've talked a little bit about disclosing, not disclosing. So we talked about that, these laws are here to protect us, but, there are going to be times when companies do discriminate, either unknowingly or, knowingly. But, and let's remember that the people who hire us are people, and there's latent bias, and there's all kinds of, we're human beings, and we come with a set of experiences, and no matter how trained somebody is, they might get it wrong. So I just wanted to throw this out in terms of hearing from some of you. What do you suppose that some of the pros to disclosing might be? This is something to think about. We don't have to spend too much time on this if it doesn't seem. Anybody? Are we getting any responses, Michelle? What might be the pros for disclosing?
One comment is, I'm not sure I have any pros.
Okay. Well, let's talk about that, because I would actually suggest that there may be. I don't know your personal situation, but I think the pros would be that it leads to open communication. There's a better understanding. How about you're being true to your career brand, right? You're being true to yourself. You're advocating. You're showing up as a whole person with who you are, your brand as a person who happens to have a disability. Okay? You also, when you disclose, you get what you need to succeed in your job and your career. So what might be some of the cons?
And actually, we did have one positive comment. I had a temporary disability that was causing a lot of stress. It was a relief to disclose it to my supervisor, especially since it led to a major temporary disability.
Oh, great. Thank you for sharing that. That's an excellent, Thank you. Some of the other cons that I hear from people is that they fear that if they're already employed and they disclose, that they might be fired, and or somehow people might think that they can't do the job, or that they might be treated differently. And those are real. When I say they're real, I mean they're real feelings, they're real emotions, they're real perspectives. But again, and actually, here's what I want to say about that, because I'm going to go to the next slide to actually underscore something that I want to say about that. This next slide actually are words of advice from a woman. Her name is Carla Fisher. She's an Intel software engineering manager, and she's a person with autism. And she used to have a Facebook page, although if you look her up on Facebook, I think it's Carla's ASD page. But also if you Google her name, you'll find a lot of stuff about her, and she's really a phenomenal resource. And even though she is a person with autism, and she's speaking about these things from her lens, I think these four tenets really can apply to many people across disability. And so one of the things is that statement about why we might be fearful to disclose is that, there's bias, or they'll be looking at me differently, or they'll think I don't have the skills, or they'll think I'm less than. And what Carla proposes is acceptance, is you can't advocate properly if you're ashamed of your own needs. You want to find role models and then talk to supportive people. So if you're having difficulty with disclosing and you want to disclose, or you're even considering it, or you're feeling frozen somehow, find your champion and talk it through, right? And approach this with confidence and self-awareness, right? And acceptance. And so awareness, it's learn your specific individual needs. Like this ricochets right back to what I was talking about in terms of your brand. Know what your brand of disability is. What are your individual needs? Write them down. Don't keep them in your head. Write them down. And then you would do this. Obviously, you would write these down and do this before you would talk to your supervisor or human resources rep, if in fact you were going to disclose. And then the timing, again. as Carla says as well, is don't wait until that there's a problem, right? And then advocate. Your peers, your boss, human resources, the employers, they're not always going to get it right. Even the employers that are, winning all kinds of awards for being the top employers for inclusive hiring. Sometimes they're not going to get it right. So, it's up to you to teach us. It's up to you to advocate, to teach us on how to get it right. Okay? And so you've got to be ready to teach and to advocate for yourself. So I thought that really kind of that might address a little bit of those when you think about disclosing and you're feeling maybe not as confident about it. Maybe use this slide to find a little bit more confidence. So when you are disclosing, though, and you do decide to disclose, you drive the conversation, right? So you want to be knowledgeable about the ADA, but only in so much that you know that there are laws that protect you. So I don't wish, or I'm not proposing that people address and come to these conversations sort of, with legal jargon and really being prepared for a fight. I think that's the wrong way to go about it. But again, it takes all kinds, and I don't know what, I think that's the wrong way to go about it, and that's just my unique perspective. But you do need to be knowledgeable about what is a reasonable accommodation at work. And actually, one of the slides that I have is a resource slide that we'll go to is, towards the end, we only have a few more slides, is it's a website called JAN, askjan.org. It stands for Job Accommodation Network. And on that website, it's really rich and robust with information. One of the things I like about it is you can look at what reasonable accommodations might be, reasonable accommodations according to a specific disability. So the person who shared their question about they have rheumatoid arthritis and shared the question about, well, should I disclose, or even, if I disclose, what would be reasonable accommodations? Maybe that might be helpful for you. Or for the person who spoke up and said, geez, what if my company says that, nothing I'm asking for is reasonable? Well, you do want to come to this conversation having done some research. So that is, you are accountable for that, right? So do some of that research on some of the sites that I'm sharing with you. And again, be knowledgeable about what accommodations you're seeking. So one of the things I want to say is that disclosure, right, is, again, there's pros, there's cons. You need to disclose if you're asking for accommodations so that you can do your job well and so that you can be successful in your job and your career. Okay, but let's face it, you disclose a disclosure isn't gonna mean a hill of beans if you aren't considered an otherwise qualified candidate and able to perform the essential functions of the job. You have to be qualified for the job, right? So they're not, to disclose, once you disclose, if you are a person with a disability, it doesn't excuse you from having to do certain elements of the job or doesn't exclude you from having to have certain, educational requirements or certifications and things like this. So I just want to be really clear about that. And this is something that employers are very clear about, is that you do have to be able to perform the essential functions of the job, period, whether you have a disability or not. Okay. So I'm giving you a sample disclosure script, right? This might be what your script looks like, but everybody's script is going to be different. Let me just see if the takeaway from this is, essentially what you want to do is you want to you want to stay away from using really medical terminology. So this person chose, I have a medical condition, right? That interferes with my ability to. And then so you probably, list some work-related tasks or not essential functions of the job, but for you, what it interferes with. But what you want to do is that you want to stress that maybe you've come up with strategies and accommodations that you've used in the past very successfully. And essentially what you're doing is, hey, I'd like to use those same or similar kind of workplace accommodations here in this company. Okay, so you approach the conversation with win-win, okay, and you drive the conversation. You have to know yourself. You have to know what works for you. You have to be confident that you have the skills and the experience to do the job, right? So that's a little bit of a disclosure, because sometimes people get stuck with what do I say. But let's talk a little bit more on the next slide, sort of more the nuts and the bolts of sort of overall tips for how do you create your own script, right? And so you want to provide general information about your disability. You can use general terms like, I have a disability, I have a medical condition, I have an illness. But again, don't get too medical and describing, sort of using medical terminology, those kinds of things. Mention your past successes, the strategies that you've worked with. Again, when you assess, when you know your brand, when you know what you're good at, when you know your value that you bring to the organization, the value that you bring to your job, you speak with a level of confidence and say, I know I can do this job, or as you know, I've been working here for X amount of years, and I've done X, Y, and Z. I've accomplished these things. But now I'm asking for an accommodation to help me to continue to achieve and be successful. Something like that, right? So you want to come with suggestions of types of accommodation. So again, what you want to avoid is disclosing and saying I have X, or I'm the person with X, and then say, what can you do for me? I know no one would do that, but again, it's not your employer's, it's not their responsibility to come up with the accommodations that are going to work for you. You need to come to the table with that information about yourself, and stay positive. Don't apologize. Do not apologize. Think win-win, and just remember, reiterate your skills and the strengths that you have that are needed for the job. Okay. So diversity-minded employers, as I've already spoken about, we have companies are really evolving, and they are becoming more diverse and inclusive. And, I've got to say that I do think it was the law. I do think it was the 2008 change to the American with Disabilities Act as amended, and also the change to the, as I spoke about, Section 503 as part of the Rehab Act, which stipulated that any federal contractors, and that's any company that receives more than $50,000 in federal funds. So, this could be universities that have financial aid, or any companies that there's thousands of companies that are considered federal contractors, and that must abide by this 7% aspiration of ensuring that they're going the mile for being considered inclusive and diversity, and including disability as part of diversity. So I think that law really kind of tipped the scales, and then companies started really thinking about, okay, what can we do about this? And I think that some companies have really done a tremendous job. Some companies have really rich and robust employee resource groups, ERGs, or they sometimes are referred to as affinity circles. And those could be for special groups like LGBTQ, could be for parents of people who have children with disabilities, it could be employees with disabilities, it could be just like, at Northeastern, where they had student groups for, Latinos, or all different kinds of ethnic groups. Well, employers are doing this now as part of an emphasis to say, hey, we include everyone. And so what you need to do is, if you're in job search or if you're employed but you want to find an employer that is more open-minded or more inclusive, you've got to do your research. So you want to go onto the websites and see what are they saying about themselves, right? If you Google top employers for hiring people with disability, you'll get a lot of information about that. But, companies have come a long ways, but not all companies are at a place that specifically meets your need. So again, you've got to do the research. You've got to find out what company culture is the right culture for you. Okay. Great. So here are some of the resources. And so here's a couple things that I wanted to call out to you on the webinar now. Is the National Organization, NOD, on Disability. They have a 3-year pilot program called Campus to Careers, and actually Northeastern is a participating partner. And they're doing that for current students now, where they're partnering and they're connecting students with a specific group of employers that I think they're Massachusetts-centric employers, but some of them have a national presence. But these employers are saying, hey, yeah, we want to work with Northeastern University students who are students with a disability. And they're also including alumni. So this link that I've given to you, and I think Michelle is going to send the PowerPoint to folks so they can have these slides along with the link, is if you're interested in learning more about the NOD and their Campus to Careers sort of program, and then also sign up for it. Signing up for it is basically just saying, hey, I'm interested. If any of your employers, please let me know. So they'll contact you once you register for that. So I wanted to bring that to your attention. And then Jobs Without Limits, again, that's a Massachusetts-centric. They connect job seekers with disabilities to Mass employers. And then the USBLN, I want to bring to your attention, is they actually have an upcoming virtual career fair. That's on April 20th. And they're specifically seeking professionals with disabilities to have a minimum of 2 years of work experience in STEM, finance or business, right? So they're looking for early career and experienced candidates. And again, I put that link on there for you, something to kind of think about. So there are lots of companies that have formal programs that get a lot of press. Some of you might have heard about Microsoft. They have an autism hiring program. And many other companies, SAP, they've got they've got their challenge to have, I think 1% of their workforce be people with on the autism spectrum. And then finally, Jan's searchable online accommodation resource. This is what I was referring to, is that you can go to this site and then specifically this link to look for accommodation options as it relates to specific disabilities that you have. Okay, because I didn't cover every possible accommodation because it's just it's so broad. So this is where the research comes in, and hopefully I've given you some ways to actually get that started. And so great. So I know we have a couple of minutes left, and I want to thank you so much for your time and your participation. And I want to encourage you to link with me on LinkedIn. Or, if you want to find me on the slides, I have my phone number. And I do have a website. My website is bostonaspergerscoach.com. But I work with a whole, people across disability. And so, reach out to me if you have any questions. And, if you have any other questions in terms of even resources that I might have, overlooked, I'd be happy to share. Michelle.
Marci, thank you so much. Your approach is very positive, and having some of the scripts and detailed examples is really useful, and your expertise is really evident, as well as the links are extremely helpful to all of us listening to this. And thank you to the participants for joining us and for the great questions. And also thanks to Ann Armstrong for being our closed captioner today. we will continue to have webinars, so keep an eye out for programs coming up. The next one will be in April on LinkedIn with Sabrina Woods. And again, thank you, Marci, for sharing your willingness to join us and to share such valuable information and making a difference for our alumni. Thank you so much, and
my pleasure.
all of you for joining us today.
Thank you. Have a great day.